secret to doing history is asking the right questions, looking in the right places, and being able to tell good stories.
You know, this man who came on the Oregon Trail in a wagon, took it in a car, and then flew over it in a plane. It just all comes together right here.
And really the secret to telling a good story is finding something that you find is personally significant or personally fascinating.
When I was a kid, we played with picture postcards from the AYP.
I was always fascinated because my grandmother wrote in her diaries about attending the fair and what a miraculous thing it was.
2009 is the 100th anniversary of the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition. And it was really Seattle's first World Fair. MOHI decided to create a special program to celebrate that event and to involve nearby historians in that process.
Discovering AYP is one of those opportunities that come up when you have a centennial and people say what happened, and those that like to delve into history, or local history particularly, say, well, let's go shake the shelves and see what falls out.
Oh yeah, cigar is a cigar. So you can smoke cigars at the fairgrounds, but not the cigarettes? No cigarette. No, it's not. It was a working railroad. Can you imagine?
Meet me in dear old Seattle, my dolly. Meet me out west at the fair. Lights will be gleaming, the golden west beaming. All the old crowd will be there. The king of expositions is the AYP, for the spirit of the place is everywhere.
The Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition was a fantastic event that was Seattle's first World's Fair in the 20th century. It took place in 1909 on the current University of Washington campus. It drew 3.7 million visitors between June 1st and October 16th. The whole campus was filled with a fairy tale landscape of buildings. The California building, the New York building, the rides that were along the Pay Street, the Ferris wheel, the Ferry Gorge Tickler, where you were hauled up 50 feet in the air and your car slowly came down. You could see all kinds of sideshows on the Midway, and the fair was filled with music every day.
In 1909, Seattle was an emerging city. It was increasingly cosmopolitan and increasingly technologically focused. So the boosters in the city decided to have a World's Fair to really showcase where the city not only had been, but where it was going. And 100 years later, we need to celebrate that because we are still recognizing the ideals, we're still realizing the ideals that these men and women set out in 1909. We're still trying to define Seattle as a cosmopolitan city that's internationally focused, that's increasingly diverse. And here at the Museum of History and Industry, we wanted a unique way to celebrate that centennial. We decided to go with the program Discovering AYP because we really wanted to encourage Seattle citizens to discover what the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition was for themselves.
Well, Discovering the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition, Discovering AYP, is an outgrowth of a program that we ran here for 10 years called Nearby History. So for 10 years, we trained thousands of people in King County Library System and Seattle Public Library to do their own history from scratch. And they were interested in a broad array of topics: their Studebaker, their family, their house, the drugstore on the corner, the house of worship, the park, all of that interested people. And then Helen Diviak and I thought it would be fun to try focusing this on one topic, focusing on the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition because of the centennial commemoration. There have been more than 200 participants in the program so far, and we're not done yet. And in the writers' seminar, we probably have about 75 active writers. And their projects range all over the place. One is writing about the smells of the AYP. Another is writing about the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the matron that was hired to police morality and purity at the fair. A number of people are writing about medicine at the fair. A couple of people are writing about law enforcement. There are people writing fiction, there are people writing nonfiction. One fellow is very interested in the music of the fair.
MOHI has been sponsoring workshops in the Seattle Public Libraries and King County Libraries. I went to one at our local library, and there were a lot of artifacts and different topics introduced.
Soon as they started to, I guess, food it but feed it.
What intrigued me was the letter from a man named Walter A. Elpide, who wrote a letter to the president of the AYP complaining that his wife and his sister-in-law went into the forestry building in one of the restrooms there to nurse their babies and was held captive there by a maid who insisted that they pay her before they could leave, 10 cents a piece, which equals better than $1.50 a piece today. They didn't have any money, so they were upset, and she wasn't going to let them leave. Here we are. I was one of those students in school who hated history. Hello, Christine. It wasn't until I began the University of Washington class in genealogy and family history, taught by Sarah Little and Lorraine McConaughey, that I began to learn to love history. Sarah taught us how to research and do the genealogy, and Lorraine taught us how to put the meat on the bones, research the time and how did our ancestors live and what was going on at that time. And through that, I just became obsessed, I think, with trying to find the stories. After we talked about what we could learn from this one-page letter, I came home and researched on ancestry.com mostly, but as many different websites as I could, trying to learn more about this man and his family. And I found several things that they were from Russia. They spoke Yiddish, so they were obviously Jewish. And he was a carpenter, and the question came up, was he working on the buildings that were built on the grounds for the fair? Now here we have the 1910 census. Here they are, Walter A. Elpide, Mattia, his wife, and here are two little girls, their daughters. Lucy is the youngest, and she's just 11 months old. So she would have been just a few weeks old and probably the babe in arms when Mattia and her sister-in-law went into the forestry building to nurse their babies. The story of these two women just interested me because I thought of them as they were in a strange country. Maybe they were speaking Yiddish. Maybe they didn't understand English that well. I just felt sorry for them. I thought, what would I do in a situation like that? They were sort of held hostage. It's just been an interesting project to make this family come alive.
Entrance is original. The couple lives upstairs there. They're friends of Christine. He's an accountant, so they're fairly well off, and we're going to go to the fair together with them. So, doorbell.
I'm a local history researcher, but I write fiction.
Then I can come back and say, hello, it's Christine. Are you ready yet? And they come down and they come out the door, and then we walk up to get on the streetcar
Everyone's looking at this as an opportunity to tell some stories, and that's what I'm doing. So I'm out looking for characters. I'm walking the streets, I'm plundering the archives, I'm going through the shoeboxes and talking to people that know something about it, and I'm even tapping my own family history. My family went to the fair. It was the big thing to do in 1909. In a past career, I actually was an investigator, a federal personnel security investigator working for the Civil Service Commission, where I would write people's biographies. And makes me, I guess, uniquely qualified because I am a history detective. I'm still banging on doors, except that I'm putting myself back in 1910 to do that.
The Alaska-Yukon Fair.
And my story is Christina's Fair, because my character is Christina. She is a Scandinavian, which is a Swedish-Norwegian young lady, second generation in Seattle. Ballard, of course. Parents are deceased, and her money's being taken care of by Ed Chilberg, president of the Scandinavian American Bank, and Ed's president of the fair.
But this was the Ballard branch of the Scandinavian American Bank, and the Chilbergs were the Scandinavian American Bank. So if she needed money, she'd come and see Mr. Chilberg, and she would come here because this is the most convenient location for a Ballard girl to meet up with him instead of going downtown to his offices downtown. So she would have come here, and the ground floor has been redone, but from what I've seen in the pictures, this would have been the front door to the bank here somewhere. So she would have come up to here to go in and meet up with Mr. Chilberg and get some money or get some advice or find out what job he got for her at the fair. Christina, she's a singer. She wants to get a job at the fair. He introduces her to the right people. She's a hostess at the Swedish building, and of course goes to every concert at the fair. She becomes a woman. She learns of men. She learns of power. She learns of art and culture. She meets people that she would have never met if it hadn't been for the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Fair. But essentially, it's a typical story of the second generation Scandinavian Americans and how the fair changed their lives.
Look at the toys. Can you play with the toys? Let's see. My project is about a baby named Ernest who was offered as a raffle prize at the AYP. He was one of 6 children that the Washington Children's Home Society had available for adoption. And he would be given to whoever showed up with the ticket as long as the Children's Home Society found that person to be suitable. I'm interested in this project because I think how a society treats its children is a true measure of the society. And I've worked in dependency and paternity work as an attorney, which is basically working with foster children. The fair itself ran from June through October, and each day had a special theme to attract different types of people. And the day that Ernest was offered was Exhibitors Day. The idea was that every paying customer who came through the gate that day was handed a raffle ticket. And part of the fun of the day was to go around to all the different locations in the exhibits and see whether your ticket matched in that exhibit hall. Ernest was in the agricultural building, so someone would have had to have walked into the agricultural building with their stub of the raffle ticket to match it up to the number at the agricultural building that represented Ernest. A lot of people had gathered and were excited to see who was going to win him, and there was quite a bit of hubbub about it, excitement about it, but that no one ever came with the ticket, so he just wasn't claimed. I decided to try to find Ernest, and the way that I did that was I contacted the Washington Children's Home Society directly, and they, based on a law passed in 1935, said that due to privacy concerns I could not have access to the record. And the bottom line, where I'm at so far, is that I have not been able to figure out what happened to him, except for the fact that there was an article the day after he was offered saying that he was not adopted, and others wanted to adopt him. He was not claimed as a prize, but others wanted to adopt him, but they were turned down because they weren't suitable. But the good thing that has come out of this is that I've learned a tremendous amount about foundlings in Seattle in 1909 and the wonderful people who were involved in the early history of helping children in Seattle. When I look at my grandson Max, who is 4 months old, he reminds me of the description of Ernest. And you think of the vulnerability of such a little baby and how Ernest was so at the whim of what the adults were going to do to him. I'm calling the project The Importance of Being Ernest after the Oscar Wilde play. And I think it is important who Ernest was, and I hope I do find him, but even if I don't, it's important to explore what happened to children in that time frame. You know, in 1909, what was it like in Seattle in 1909 for children who didn't have parents? This is a whirligig of a man. As I look at my antique toy collection, it reminds me that childhood may have changed somewhat in the last 100 years, but in many ways it's still the same. We hope that Ernest, 100 years ago, was adopted and had the chance to play with toys like these.
So there's a scene in my novel where they've been looking at Rainier Vista and admiring the grandeur of Mount Rainier, and Grace looks over and she sees a man and a woman in one of the rose gardens, and the woman is standing with her big skirts,
like holding her skirts out.
Yeah, just looking kind of nonchalant, and the man is trying to dig up one of the rose bushes.
Crazy.
Because I'd read that was a problem, and so.
My project is a novel for young adults set here in Seattle starting in 1907. And it's about a young girl with a Norwegian family who comes here after her father is injured in a logging accident in a logging camp. And her father gets a job with the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Expo, and so she spends the summer at the expo and meets all the different people, different characters at the expo, including she meets one of the boys from the St. Olaf band who came out here to perform and gets her first kiss. She befriends one of the entertainers, young girl in the Eskimo village. She meets people from all over the world and sees all kinds of exciting things that kind of expand her world. It's a coming-of-age story about a girl who grows up in the very exciting period of American history where so much was in transition. So I'm doing a lot of research in terms of what was Norwegian American culture like at that time.
So I was looking at the film from Norway Day at the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Expo, and I noticed that this dress is very much like the dresses the women were wearing in the film. Can you tell me something about it?
Well, it's from Hallingdal.
Luckily, Ballard has this great museum, the Nordic Heritage Museum, and I had the great fortune to get introduced to Olaf Kwame, who is kind of a senior statesman in the history community here in Ballard.
It's sort of a miracle to me, looking back on 1909, to think that the Norwegian community could have such an impact on the AYP. In very short time to have this Viking boat built that brought Leif Erikson across to the AYP grounds, and the hundreds of people that participated in the marching up to the meeting place with thousands of people meeting there and participating. Just looking at the film can give you the feeling of the importance that the Norwegian community did give. And it's really nice, Phyllis, that you're focusing on that whole era and the novel that you're writing that takes into account all these bits and pieces that were occurring 100 years ago.
We might be sort of walking through the Chinese village at this point, which Ah Sing, who was a local Chinese businessman, was the person who had that concession. So that has a really strong local tie to it. And so I know that for your novel that you're interested in, you're particularly interested in the Alaska, the Eskimo village. So we're pretty much coming to that right now.
In doing research for my novel, I decided that I needed to get some more historic expertise, so I asked my friend Paula Becker, who's a staff historian for HistoryLink, to come with me and show me where on the modern-day campus of the UW some of the sites of the AYP would have been.
I should show you something since we're right here by the Arctic Circle. I should show you a picture because Grace, as being someone who took care of children at the fair, would have been very cognizant of the number of children's days that they have, where extra children came, and one of those children's days happened really, okay, so here's where we are. These Cascade fountains would have been right there, and that was the government building. But what I wanted to show you was this picture. This is the same body of water. It's been rebuilt since then, but it's basically the same fountain. And so here are all these children, and they're standing right where we are standing right now. And this was Children's Day on June 5th. So today's June 2nd. 3 days from now will be exactly 100 years since that happened. And right here.
That's interesting. There's a lie in here. It says that the biggest crowd that has yet attended the exposition was out today to make welcome for the visitors from Illinois. But really it was only about 13,000 people, and the first day it was like 90,000. So. My project is called Boomers and Boosters, Chicago Day at the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition. And it's about a group of 40 businessmen who traveled from Chicago to Seattle in order to visit the fair and also in order to boost Chicago as the center of trade in the US and to boom their message of kind of commercial interdependency between the different cities of America. The trip that they took was a really exciting trip. They chartered a train, and in order to get to Seattle, they traveled through Montana and Wyoming and North Dakota and Idaho. And they went back a different route through Oregon and Utah and Colorado and Nebraska. And they ended up traveling, I think it was 6,000 miles in 17 days and visited 37 cities along the way. They left on the 30th of May, and about a week later they arrived in Seattle. So it was great to look at this photo, wonder who all these 40 people are, and then months later to know the personal stories of the individuals in there. So one of the guys, the guy from the Chicago Record-Herald, was a satirist who wrote sarcastic and silly pieces. And one anecdote I thought was nice was the story of them coming back to their hotel one night. I suppose they were probably out carousing. And their cable car from downtown to their hotel up on the top of First Hill had broken down. So they were forced to walk back to the hotel. And he talks about how people from Chicago are used to flat land, the plains people, and how they were just exhausted after every half block they had to take a break. He said that they blew like porpoises because they were breathing so hard. He was amazed at the fact that Seattleites could walk up these steep hills with no problem, until he discovered that they had a unique gait, as he put it, where they walked laterally across the sidewalk, cutting the hill down.
I'm glad you brought this photo in. You mentioned you saw Nadeau up in the back of the photograph here. He was president of the Rainier Club during the construction of the AYPE and then became the director general of the AYPE.
In the 3 days that the association was in Seattle, there were 3 banquets or luncheons that I know of that were held for them. And then the third was at the Rainier Club, which is a banquet held for them just a couple of hours before they left on their train headed north to Bellingham and Everett. The Rainier Club was and is an elite club for the leadership of Seattle. Back then it was a men's club only, not surprising.
So I want to show you a piece that we have that's sort of special to us that was part of the exposition.
Okay.
This Frank Benson painting that we own, Girl with a Veil.
It was difficult to imagine what the banquet could be just from a few descriptions in the newspapers from back then. So the best way to do it, to figure out what it might have looked like, was to go and visit the Rainier Club, which they were gracious enough to give us a tour and show us around the potential spots that might have held the banquet.
So Rob, this is one of the spaces that we think could have been used, as this was the member dining room in this portion of the club from this area south. It's now divided into the fireside lounge and a couple of other meeting spaces, but it would have been of size to hold 80 people for the banquet. Here I have a piece of the china from our original china set, which has been in existence over 100 years. So this, while this isn't the plate, it's this pattern that has been serving people since that time. So this is what would have been in front of the group as they dined here back in 1909.
Really? This is my paper started with 5 words. Chicago Association of Commerce Day. 5 words that really meant nothing. So I now find myself with maybe 14,000 words in this huge essay that needs to get whittled way down to 5,000 words. So it's left me with a realization that I don't just have a passing interest in history. I love to dig into these topics. I love to go and learn about new things, not just from secondary or tertiary sources that have already digested and brought out the important points of a topic, but to go and dig through all of the original source material and find the outstanding parts of the story for myself.
We've worked with a lot of people who thought that they would never be interested in history, and they thought they could never do history.
How common is it to nurse babies in 1909?
And then you bring it down to a level where they understand it and say, you can do this, find something that interests you. And they almost all have this aha experience when they realize that their lives really are connected to history, that history doesn't just happen to extraordinary people in extraordinary times, but history happens every day to everyday people.
So this is the George Washington statue, and this actually statue would have been about 50 yards to our south here where the original entrance to the AYP was.
These people, so dissonant, so different from one another, somehow as they research, looking out from one another's projects, they create a kind of community that is very strong, it's very subtle, and it's the kind of community I think we really need. We stand in need of it at the beginning of the 21st century.
Mohi has done something very unique here. Lorraine McConaughey and Helen Diviak have put together something that is a synthesis of an exhibition where we look at original documents, of a classroom where we learn some background in history, of a seminar where we all can speak together. And then there's something that happens sort of in addition. You come away with a very positive feeling about, oh, I want to go do some research. I want to go in there and find this stuff. You know, this is hot. This is exciting to do. And I'm not alone. There are all kinds of people doing this sort of work. And that has a positive effect in how you feel about your cultural institutions, about the history of your community, how you want to protect your community, promote it, be a part of it.
There's something magical to me about history. It just makes you appreciate where you live so much more when you think about how it used to be and how people got through life and the types of obstacles that they had to face and people that helped each other and built this community. I mean, it's a wonderful thing to remind yourself about that. Any museum or library that could start a program like this would be advised to do it because it brings the people together in a way that you don't have the opportunity to do very often in our busy lives and in the cities where we live. Sometimes it's hard to connect with other people, and this makes people connect in a very personal way for the benefit of all.